Okay, so this is the last lecture. We'll tell you about how to navigate the ethics review process. I think many of you will be interested because some of you are members of ethics review committees. Some are potential REC members, and even the researchers among you will have to know this so that you know what to expect from the ethics review committee. Okay, so of course the researcher would like to know at which point she should do certain things and if she's on the right track, and when will she expect a response from the ethics review committee. It's not a long wait actually, because in the SOP of most RECs, there are timelines stipulated for each specific process and for each step in the process. Okay, so this will be interesting to both the REC members and the researcher. Okay, this is the outline. And let's go through the review process. The ethics review process is a systematic evaluation of a protocol and seeing to it that there is ethical soundness and scientific validity of the protocol, and it breaks no rules and follows policies and guidelines, both international and national. And the initial, continuing, and final review of the protocol and the outcome are stipulated in the different administrative orders and memorandum from the joint DOST, DOH, CHED, UP Manila, as well as a CHED memo in 2007. So what's the purpose of a research ethics review? Primarily, it's to protect the welfare of the human participant and the community, and to see to it that there is integrity in the outcome and data of the research conducted, and the review process itself will improve the protocol and the conduct of the research, therefore improve research in general. So what are the steps in the review process? Initially, in the beginning, documents are submitted by the researcher. So there's an application form. Usually, research ethics committees have websites and the application forms are downloadable. And the researcher fills it up, submits it to go together with the proposal, the informed consent form, and the assessment forms. Then it should contain the study tools, the curriculum vitae of the investigators and the team members, and then certificates of research ethics training. In clinical trials, we require good clinical practice training, the ICH-GCP training, which should be valid within 3 years. And some research ethics committee perform the technical and the ethical review together. But some research ethics committees require a prior technical review and approval of the proposal before they will accept the proposal for ethical review. Of course, it should contain information as to the source of the funds, either from a funding agency, sponsors, or from the institution. And there should be a statement regarding conflict of interest in the investigator and team members. And of course, the budget of the whole study. So the submission is given to the secretariat. Submissions nowadays are online because of the pandemic, but before the pandemic, it used to be hard copies being submitted. So it's a secretariat which accepts the proposal and the complete package and checks for the completeness of the required documents and logs it in the logbook. And of course, they have to give a receiving copy to the researcher who submitted the proposal. And the REC should have in their office the time frame for the completion of the whole review process so that the researcher is well informed when to follow up the result of the review by the REC. Then the chair or whoever is the designated personnel in the REC will try to see what kind of review is appropriate for the proposal. The kind of review depends on the vulnerability of the population involved and the risks involved in the study. And appropriate reviewers are assigned. Usually, most RECs do the primary reviewer method. 2 or 3 reviewers will do a very thorough review of the proposal. And the other members are just given the summary or the abstract. That's the full review. And for expedited review, primary reviewers are also assigned. And the expertise of the reviewer should be appropriate to the kind of study which is being proposed. So for example, if it's a social scientist who's a member of the REC, then the social sciences are assigned to him or her. If let's say it's a pediatric study, there should be at least one pediatrician among the reviewers who will do a thorough assessment of the protocol. So what are the different kinds of review? The first is the exempt from review. It is not the researcher who will decide that his proposal is exempt from review. Therefore, he will not submit it to the Research Ethics Committee. He has to submit it, and it's the REC which will decide that this is exempt from review. It doesn't need to go through the full board or expedited process of review. And these studies are usually those involving non-identifiable human tissues, biological samples, or pooled data, and not involving human participants. So yung mga animal studies, pwede na dito. And basically, the REC has to include in its annual report submitted to the FREB the list of exempted protocols that they received for the year. The expedited review involves studies which have no more than minimal risk and not involving vulnerable participants. And also the nature of the study should be not sensitive or confidential. So 1 or 2 primary reviewers and the chair approves the expedited review. or sometimes if there's a non-agreement between the primary reviewers, it's given for a full review assessment. What's a full review? Protocols involving more than minimal risk to the participants, involving vulnerable population, go through full review. It's discussed and approved in an ethics review committee meeting. So it's put in the agenda of the meeting. So during a full review, what happens? First, there should be a declaration of any member who has a conflict of interest. For example, if one member of the research ethics committee is a researcher or investigator, then that member should declare that there's a conflict of interest regarding one of the protocols and should be excluded from the discussion of that protocol. Not necessarily the whole meeting, because it might be just one protocol and not all the protocols. Also, there's a presentation by the two primary reviewers. So the primary reviewers recite their findings, and there's a structured way of doing things that they go through each parameter in the assessment so that none is missed, and it's going to be very thorough, because once they make the recommendations, those are the recommendations, and then it's given to the PI. They cannot go through the same document again in the subsequent meetings and then find new findings that they didn't notice before. So it's really should be very thorough. And it's the primary reviewers who are responsible for leading the discussion and the presentation of the protocol. And the other members who have been given also a copy of the proposal, or sometimes the summary, will join in the discussion. If it is necessary and the PI is invited, then the PI or the researcher is asked to attend the meeting, and clarifications and questions are being asked to facilitate the decision making regarding the study. And sometimes an independent consultant whose expertise is not present among the members is invited to give technical clarifications and also serve as a resource person regarding the expertise of the independent consultant. So after the discussion, all the important points are summarized by the chair, and deliberation occurs, and voting or consensus is reached by the members. So there should always be a quorum. And in a full board meeting, a quorum can be declared only if there's a lay member present and a non-affiliated research ethics committee meeting, besides the numerical definition of quorum by the REC. Okay, so what's the criteria for approval? First, there should be social value. If there's no social value, I don't think it's worth doing the study. And then we mentioned earlier, and since yesterday, that there should be scientific as well as ethical soundness of the proposal. And the informed consent or assent should be satisfactory. The vulnerable issues have been addressed. The risks and benefits and safety issues are acceptable. Privacy and confidentiality of the participants will be assured, and there's justice in the whole process or procedure of the protocol. The researchers should be qualified, and the facilities where the study will be conducted should be appropriate and adequate. And there should be a transparency in all the procedures that will be done. And consideration of all stakeholders have been considered or taken into account. And therefore, that will warrant approval of the proposal. So in the initial review, there are 4 decisions actually: approved, minor modification, and major modification, and then disapproved. Usually we don't disapprove a proposal unless it's really not acceptable. But when a proposal is disapproved, the letter to the researcher should contain the reasons why the proposal has been disapproved. Oftentimes, modifications are required, and the modifications will come with recommendations. What specific recommendations will the Research Ethics Committee require from the researcher so that it can be improved, and upon resubmission, if found satisfactory, will be subsequently approved by the Research Ethics Committee. Now, after the meeting, a letter is sent to the researcher, and the feedback should be within 4 weeks of the application, and the decision is given. So once it's approved, implementation of the protocol can now be started. If the researcher is not happy with the decision of the Research Ethics Committee, he can appeal, especially if it's a disapproval. So the Research Ethics Committee should always be open for dialogue with the researchers. And there should be a portion in the standard operating procedure of the Research Ethics Committee that allows an appeal for reconsideration of the REC decisions. After the researcher has accepted the letter, then the researcher will make the appropriate or pertinent revisions or modifications according to the recommendations of the Research Ethics Committee. And then the researcher should submit it as soon as possible to the Research Ethics Committee. The problem oftentimes that is the cause of delay for the approval, final approval of the proposal is that the researcher takes too long to do the modifications and revisions. So the researcher should resubmit, and then it goes back now to the Research Ethics Committee, and it's reviewed by previously assigned reviewers, because the previously assigned primary reviewers are already familiar with the protocol, and it facilitates the review of the resubmitted documents. Okay, and so then the proposal gets approved, and the letter that will be given to the researcher will contain the obligations of the researcher regarding post-approval reports that must be submitted to allow the Research Ethics Committee to have oversight and to monitor the progress of the study. So depending on the risk involved, the progress reports might be required more frequently than those involving low or no more than minimal risk. Otherwise, usually if it's just no more than minimal risk or low risk, it's just an annual report that is required. So if there were conflict of interests identified, it should have been resolved. And then different changes in the protocol which had been approved should not be implemented unless the protocol has been amended and approved by the Research Ethics Committee. Unless it is necessary to institute changes in the protocol so as to protect the safety of the participant. After instituting the necessary urgent or emergency measures, then the amendments should be submitted as soon as possible. And sometimes, when warranted, the informed consent can also be amended or revised. And if reconsenting is done, then it should also be submitted to the Research Ethics Committee that reconsenting was done, and the revised informed consent should also be submitted to the REC. Okay. So the researcher should submit the reports after the proposal has been or the protocol has been approved within a specific time frame, and the documents are again reviewed by previously assigned reviewers. And it depends. Full board review approved protocols should go back to full board review in terms of post-approval report review. Those that had been approved by expedited process can go to expedited review also of the post-approval reports, unless there are some specific reasons wherein or changes wherein the expedited review approved protocols will have to go through full board in terms of post-approval reports. So decisions are also made by the reviewers or the board, and these are listed in the minutes of the meeting. Okay, what reports are required from the researcher after the protocol has been approved and implemented? The amendment of the protocol or the informed consent. No amendment of the protocol or informed consent should be implemented before it has been approved by the Research Ethics Committee. Then we have the progress or interim reports and protocol deviations or violations. Protocol deviations and violations do not need prior approval because this has happened and it has to be reported to the Research Ethics Committee. Just seeing to it that although there were violations or deviations in the implementation, the Research Ethics Committee will try to see whether because of the violations or deviations, the patients were harmed or put at an increased risk. Serious adverse events, serious unexpected suspected adverse reactions, and in social behavioral sciences, we have what we call the reportable negative events. All of these should be reported to the Research Ethics Committee. There are specific time frames required, and it's stipulated in the standard operating procedure of the or manual of the REC. Like SUSARs and AEs should be reported, let's say, within 1 week from the knowledge of such events. And of course, analysis of this should have been done and submitted to the Research Ethics Committee. Some research ethics committees, especially those handling clinical trials, have Safety Adverse Event Committee, specifically under the Research Ethics Committee, to analyze on-site SAEs and SUSARs. Early termination should be also submitted, and in the early termination report, the reason why the study is being terminated even before the expected duration of the end of the study should be indicated in the report. Sometimes in clinical trials, when it has been proven that the drug, for example, really works and works better than what is now available in the market, the trial is already terminated, and the application to the FDA is fast-tracked, so that more patients will be able to benefit from the advantages or the effects of the drug. The participant queries and complaints should also be submitted to the REC. So there's transparency. And after 1 year, usually the validity of the, or certificate of validity of the ethics approval is good for 1 year. So before 1 year is over, there should have been an application for continuing review, meaning the Research Ethics Committee will get all the documents related to the protocol or to the study, all the previously mentioned documents from 1 to 6 will now be evaluated by the Research Ethics Committee, and will decide, the Research Ethics Committee will decide whether the study can still continue after the 1 year validity. It's important that the continuing review be done prior to the expiration of the certificate of approval for the protocol, because if there is an expiration of the certificate of approval, any data gathered after the expiration of the approval cannot be utilized by the researcher. And therefore, the Research Ethics Committee sometimes helps the researcher by giving a reminder that the research ethics approval is due for review again, so that there's going to be a continuity in the, or no disruption in the study implementation. And at the end of the study, there should be a report of ends of study. The researcher will say, I have now finished gathering my data, and I have gathered already, let's say, the desired number of population. And so I'm informing you, I'm stopping now my recruitment. And I'm going to do now the statistical analysis. After that, when the final report is available, the final report should also, a copy of the final report should be submitted also to the Research Ethics Committee. Okay, so in the amendments of protocol or in informed consent form, 2 types can be done in terms of review. If the amendment does not change the risk or the profile of the participants, and no vulnerability has been produced, it goes through expedited review. And it is not really faster, but it needs only about 2 primary reviewers rather than the whole board reviewing and assessing the amendment. In the full review, amendments which will increase the risk to the participants, like for example, change in study design, you added another treatment, or you removed one type of treatment, you change the inclusion and exclusion criteria, basically changing the kind of participants you're now going to enroll. And like, for example, significant change in number of subjects, like you think now 20 is inadequate, you want to increase it to 50, that's a significant change of number. Also, the change in dosage, like if you're going to give now, let's say 250 seems like not to work, so you'll make it 500 milligrams of the medicine, or from per orem or orally administered drug, now you're going to give it intravenously. Those are major changes. Therefore, before implementation of those changes, then amendment can be submitted, and you wait for the decision of the Research Ethics Committee before you can implement it. Instead of the researcher trying to submit another protocol, if only a portion will be changed, amendment will be more appropriate. And these are the actions of the Research Ethics Committee. Maybe they want to get additional information before they approve it, and therefore the researchers should submit the additional documents required. Okay, in the progress or interim reports, the frequency, as I said before, will be dependent on the level of risk involved. And it is stated in the approval letter that you should submit progress interim reports, let's say every quarter, after 6 months, or usually annually ang progress reports, kung no more than minimal risks. Okay? And these are the contents of the progress reports, yung amendments, changes and problems encountered, and then how many participants dropped out. So, ibig sabihin, usually pag ganyan yung attrition, ang iniisip niya ng REC due to the negative effects. Although the reason might be kasi wala ng pamasahe, or ayaw niya na kasi nahihirapan siyang mag-report sa researcher, etc. Or usually sasabihin, baka for the sake of the participants ang iniisip niya ng REC, baka dahil side effects. Okay? So that more or less will be operating on the safe side rather than tinamad lang yung participant. Okay. And these are the decisions of the REC. Now for protocol deviations, hindi lahat ng protocol deviations at violations ay kasalanan ng researcher. Many of them dahil sa lapses ng participants. Halimbawa, sasabihin mo, visit every 2 weeks. Nahirapang makabiyahe yung participant. After 2.5 weeks na siya naka-report sa researcher. O i-report yun na nag-deviate yung participant sa protocol. Tapos sasabihin din kung ano ang impact ng deviation sa participant, tapos ano na ang ginawa niya para maremedyohan niya yung lapses ng participant, o kaya lapses ng research assistant. So nag-educate ba sila, nag-reorient ba sila, re-educate ba sila ng participants or ng staff nila, etc. So dapat naka-indicate din dun sa protocol deviation report kung ano na ang remedial measures. And then, titingnan kung major deviation doon, kailangan bang ipa-amend yung kanyang protocol or ICF, etc. Not necessarily na ipatitigil or ipahinto o isususpend ang study. Okay? So, usually, the REC says, 1 week from detection of the deviation or violation, report na agad sa amin. And ibibigay din yung documents na yon sa same primary reviewers that initially assessed the proposal. So these are the decisions that can be done regarding protocol deviations. Okay, what about serious adverse events and SUSARs, the unexpected, suspected, unexpected serious adverse reactions? These should be reported. Usually, these are reports generated by the sponsored clinical trials. Makapal ang mga dokumentong binibigay nila niyan. So, and then the report, whatever happens even in Brazil or in the United States, etc. But what the Research Ethics Committee is most concerned about are the on-site SAEs and SUSARs. The off-site, meaning another site, even in the Philippines or out of the country, another country, usually it's noted and put as a reference for trending na halimbawa, ilan na ang namatay sa abroad. Dito sa Pilipinas, wala pa. Teka, baka mamaya may nangyayari na rin dito sa Pilipinas, hindi lang nare-report. That sort of alerts the Research Ethics Committee of the possibilities of SAEs and SUSARs happening on-site, dun sa kanyang sariling site. Okay? So, these are also submitted to the FDA, and the principal investigator gets a copy of it. And the PI should submit it to the Level 3 Research Ethics Committee in charge of clinical trials for FDA registration. Okay, so when to report? Pag namatay o kaya life-threatening na ospital, it should be within 3 days that the investigator or researcher has come to know about the event. Other events can be usually within 10 days. And the REC evaluates these. Titingnan ngayon yung safety profile. Re-reviewin nila yung safety profile ng medicine or ng device or study drug. Okay, may SAE committee, subcommittee yung ibang REC. And we encourage research ethics committees with so many clinical trials to have a specific SAE subcommittee attending to the reports being submitted to them. Okay. Then we talk about the reportable negative events. These are experiences of researchers that involve personal safety issues, can involve both or either the researcher or the research participant in very sensitive and high risk, more than minimal risk studies, social behavioral studies. Like for example, if you're studying sexual harassment, or sexual abuses, or for example, drug use etc., or violence against specific population, things such as this can result to reportable negative experiences, and it should be reported to the REC as well. Ito yung equivalent ng SAEs and SUSARs in clinical trials. Okay. So, what about premature termination or suspension of the study? Usually, hindi ito common eh. Hindi common ang premature termination or suspension of the study. But it's possible that it should be recommended by the Research Ethics Committee. When there's poor recruitment, napakadami ng mga suspected serious, unusual adverse reactions. Or if the clinical question has been answered, yung hypothesis niya na, solve niya na, no need to subject the participants to further interventions. So, therefore, the study can be terminated prematurely. Or there's breach in the, for example, in the protocol that will impact on the safety of the participants, should be suspended, the study. And even if the study has been terminated prematurely, the report should contain a mechanism or a provision on the care and follow-up of those participants who were enrolled in the study. So, may provision siya na, if a follow-up namin to, halimbawa, supposed to be ang study for 1 year, after 8 months, na-resolve niya na ang kanyang question and the drug has been proven very, very effective. So, dapat dun sa premature termination report, nakalagay doon, if a follow-up ko pa rin siya hanggang 1 year, rather than stop at everything at 8 months. Okay. So, sometimes the REC will recommend the early termination. Okay, especially when the participants are put at high risk of harm that cannot be minimized. So, it is justified for the REC to recommend early termination. Okay. Now, participants' complaints and queries. Sa standard operating procedure ng REC, nire-require ngayon ng 2020 FREB policies and guidelines for accreditation of research ethics committees. Yung kailangan meron siyang provision for participants' queries and complaints. It can come from stakeholders, be it by telephone, be it by written, or sometimes you can get it from social media, yung mga emails, Facebook, etc. Dapat na monitor din yun. It can come from all stakeholders, and the REC should look at it promptly, because pag yan inupuan nila, mas maraming complaints ang ma-generate, or kaya it can jeopardize the welfare of the participants. And attending to the queries and complaints will promote trust and confidence in the Research Ethics Committee and the institution. Hindi nagpapabaya yung REC at saka yung institution. And ultimately, the welfare of the participants are assured. Okay, application for continuing review, dapat hindi maglalapse yung ethical clearance. So, dapat 1 month before nakapag-submit na ang researcher for application para the next meeting, makuha niya na ang decision ng Research Ethics Committee. Okay? So, final report. Yung final report should be submitted not later than 8 weeks after the end of the study. Kasi pagka magkalimutan na, alam ko yung ibang universities, wala na dun yung mga estudyante. Hindi pa rin na sasubmit yung final report. So, pag walang final report, the protocol file is still open. Pag nagpa-accredit, titingnan doon yung how many files have you had nung ganitong year, kailan nyo na-archive. Pag open pa, 3 taon na, ano na nangyari? Ang study, one year lang. Kasi wala pa hong final report. Abang may problema kayo. So yung iba naman nahaharang. No final report of the research done, no graduation. But all final reports are reported in a full review. All final reports are reported. So, the final report, the REC will assess whether sinunod ba talaga yung kompleto ba yung kanyang conclusion, swak ba doon sa methodology, etc. Yung benefits to the participant be disseminated. Okay? Kasi kung yung final report niya matutulog lang sa cabinet ng library, useless yung study niya. Sayang yung time. Sayang din yung effort ng Research Ethics Committee helping that researcher produce a good study. So dapat yung pinaghirapan may benefit doon sa participants at sa community at i-disseminate. And mas maganda i-publish. Okay? So these are the different stages. Looks long and tedious. It really is for the Research Ethics Committee kasi marami silang documentation na kailangan i-fulfill. Okay? So advice to the researchers, you will benefit so much from the review. The Research Ethics Review Committee is not a hindrance to the progress of your research. It will help you improve your research proposal enormously. And minsan nga sinasabi ko, para akong gumawa na ng bagong proposal dito sa ni-review ko sa modification na ni-recommend ko. So in the end, parang pag inayos mo yung implementation ng proposal and you get a good outcome, publishable ang makukuha mong document. So the review should serve as an educational and a collegial exercise between the Research Ethics Committee and the researcher. And the approval will be required. Maski ngayon sa medicine, ang mga specialty boards, societies, nagre-require na ng Research Ethics Committee approved studies. Ang alam ko, ang pediatrics, Philippine Pediatric Society, wala kang paper na isinabmit na approve ng Research Ethics Committee, hindi ka makakakuha ng specialty board exam. Hindi ka magiging espesyalista. So, gumawa ka muna ng paper na approved ng Research Ethics Committee at natapos mo, isubmit mo sa amin. Bago ka namin papayagang kumuha ng specialty board exam. So, that's strict. And then the researcher should really be humble enough to follow the suggestions of the Research Ethics Committee. And that will produce a good working relationship between the Research Ethics Committee and the researcher. Okay? A good systematic review of any protocol will say it has undergone a fair and transparent process so that the scientific and ethical soundness of the proposal has been evaluated. Therefore, whatever outcome it will generate. And so all of us will benefit from the review of a research ethics committee. Okay, you have any question?